Will you help me welcome Gaylon Ross? Thank you very much, Sam. Pleasure to be with you. Let me just make a comment about your last statement. I'm convinced that they were not involved, but you know, you can poke a rattlesnake often enough and he's finally going to strike. I think the CIA may have poked the Taliban and bin Laden until he finally made a strike, and then they jumped on it and said, oh, now we got reason to do all these things we're fixing to do to these people. So that's my position on it. It's a pleasure to be with you smiling people tonight. I'm going to tell you some things tonight that you have never heard before unless you read my book, and a couple of people have already read it, or unless you heard me talk on Stan's program. But I'll give you some details that I didn't give on that program. We're going to talk about who's who of the elite, and also the elite serial killers of Lincoln, JFK, RFK, and MLK. The first book is Who's Who of the Elite, members of the Bilderbergs, Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, Skull and Bone Society. Let's first of all talk about the Council on Foreign Relations. It was founded in 1921 by the group of people that attended the Paris peace talks, and they felt a need to create an organization within the United States to control foreign policy as well as domestic policy. So in 1921 is when they were founded. It was first made up of citizens or the residents of the New York area only. It was later expanded to Washington, D.C., and then in the last 15 or so years they set up committees throughout the United States in the major large cities of the United States, and they call them committees, but they're all part of the Council of Foreign Relations. A member of the Council of Foreign Relations is a member for life unless they violate some of their rules. One of the rules is, and I'll discuss in just a second, but, well, it's just one of the bylaws says that if a member attributes any statement made in a Council on Foreign Relations meeting to any outsider, that they will be immediately taken before the inner council and will be expelled from the organization. It's really worse than that. They will very likely be fired from their job, whatever it is, because they control everything. They will be blackballed from their industry, and they will have to take up a whole new profession, because these people are serious. They're probably just as bad or worse than the mafia. Once you're in, you don't get out, and you don't tell about what goes on. The next group we'll talk about is the Bilderbergs, founded in 1954. There's a fellow named Dr. Joseph Hieronymus Rittinger came up with the idea of forming a secret organization of people located in Western Europe and North America, and he went to Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, made the pitch to him. Prince Bernhard grabbed the idea, and they both came to the United States. They met with people like Averill Harriman, David Rockefeller, and General Walter B. Smith. General Smith at that time was director of the CIA, and he told the two that if they'd come to him first, it'd save them a lot of time, because the CIA was more than happy to fund everything that the Bilderbergs did, and they have funded that operation ever since. Their first meeting was in 1954 in a hotel in Holland or the Netherlands. The name of the hotel was the Bilderberg Hotel, and ever since they have retained that name in their title of their conference. They call it the Bilderberg Conference. And the people that are there, they call them attendees. They say there are no members. That's not true because they have a steering committee and an executive committee. They have members of those committees. They meet regularly. And so they make a lot of statements that are not true, but that's one of them that they made. It's made up of people from Western Europe, United States, and Canada. The attendees are typically kings and queens and monarchs of Europe, heads of state in these countries, heads of the media, mainstream media, CEOs of the largest corporations in the world. They also include people in the military, people in our government, State Department, finance, bankers. And when they meet, the Bilderbergs is the most secret of the three groups. One example is when they met in Switzerland several years ago. They met there were 3 hotels on top of a mountain. And the only way to these hotels was a one-lane road up the mountain. And they stationed a security guard with a submachine gun about every 500 yards up that mountain on that road. 3 days before the attendees arrived, they sent special teams in to check all of the buildings for video or audio monitoring devices or bugs to make sure that they were not being listened to. All the guests in the hotel had to leave. They never booked guests during the times that the Bilderbergs are there. All the employees have to leave. They bring in their own cooks and waiters and security people. And the country in which they meet must furnish the primary security for their meetings. And they also have their own that stay with them. And in earlier years, the security guards were told to arrest anyone that tried to get within 100 yards of the building they were that met in. In the last couple of years, they told the security people, shoot to kill anybody that gets to the barrier. They're very serious about what they do. They say they only discuss common problems between Western Europe and North America. In reality, they determine everything of significance everywhere in the world. They select world leaders. In 1992, William Jefferson Clinton attended the Bilderberg meeting, and the next year he became president of the United States. The next year, Tony Blair attended the Bilderberg meeting, and the following year he became Prime Minister of England. The following year, the Prime Minister of Spain attended the Bilderberg meeting, and he was allowed into his post the following year. They not only put people in the office, they take them out. And that'll be the subject of my second book. Now, typically there are around 90 to 100 people attend these events. So sometimes it's less, sometimes it might go up to 125. Next group I'll talk about is the Trilateral Commission. It was founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller. He asked Brzezinski to go to Japan and around the United States and Canada and Western Europe and select delegates to be a member of a new organization that David Rockefeller founded called the Trilateral Commission. The reason is it's made up of 3 general areas, Japan, North America, and Western Europe. These people meet typically once a year, rarely in the same place twice. The Bilderbergs never meet in the same place twice. Every time they've met in the United States, they met on property owned by the Rockefellers. But this organization was founded in '73. In that time, David Rockefeller was aware that the 15 largest banks in the world, where Japan was included in this secret group. In the last meeting, there were 96 delegates from the U.S. and Canada, 157 from Europe, European Union or Western Europe, and 75 from Japan. Now, the object of these three secret organizations, there's only one object, and that is to form a one world government. When George Herbert Walker Bush was president, he stated in several of his speeches the term New World Order. Anyone that really knows what they're doing will never, within the elite, never use the term New World Order again. Because when they do, the audience eyes open up, they sit on the edge of their seat and become very attentive. They have substituted a new generic term, and they call it global. Anytime they use the term global union, global architecture, global economy, global market, that exactly equals New World Order. So don't let them fool you. Now let's talk about some of the members of the elite. And in my book, I list all of the members from about 1992 to the year 2000 of all three secret organizations. In this book, I also list every member of the Bilderbergs from the day they were founded in 1954. So let's just take the current list, and let's start with just the key groups within our federal government. Executive Office of the President. William Jefferson Clinton was a member of the Bilderbergs Council of Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. His wife Hillary attended the Bilderberg meeting when they met in Georgia on an island north of Atlanta. Her name did not appear as on the official list of attendees, but there was a Patriot member there with a still camera with a photo lens, and he took a picture of Hillary getting out of a limousine as she entered the building where the Bilderberg meetings were held. Now, why do I say that they don't always list everybody as attendees? One of my major sources of information on the Bilderbergs is my partner in Germany. He's fixing to publish Who's Who of the Elite in the German language. And when Dr. Joseph Rittinger died, all of his private papers went into the archives in Frankfurt, Germany. My partner just happens to live in Frankfurt. He's a very brilliant young man. He just somehow, well, I don't say somehow, God guided him in there. He went into the archives. The clerk on duty spoke on German, could not read English. All of the Bilderberg papers are in English, and he asked to see the documents that had the name Bilderberg on them, and so this clerk brought him a whole pile of documents. He looked through them, and he could see he struck a gold mine, and so he asked the clerk, he's a German citizen, so he asked her in German if he could copy these documents, and that person said, I don't know why not, go ahead. And so he copied these documents and sent them to me. Now, Stan mentioned earlier that people that, like myself, when they need something, all of a sudden it just appears. That's happened throughout my research. I'll give you a glowing example. I was walking down the aisle of the stacks in the library at Southwest Texas University, and all of a sudden something compelled me to stop. And I stopped and turned to the right, and on the bookshelf right at eye level was a book simply titled David. I reached up and pulled that book off the shelf, looked for a table of contents, there was none. I looked for an index, there was none. So I just opened up roughly in the center of the book, and on the left-hand page, about the center of the page, I saw the name David Rockefeller, and shortly after that the term Bilderberg. That was my first exposure to the Bilderbergs. Now, chance would not make me do that. People just don't do that. Often people will just send me information and they don't even know I need it or want it. but when it arrives, that's just about the time that I need it. And when it happens, I just say, thank you, you're on time. And but I'm very grateful that I have been selected to do this. I'm purely a scribe. I'm just the Paul Revere of today, trying to get the word out. And often people say, if you talk about these secret organizations and people involved in all of this bad stuff, aren't you afraid they're going to kill you? And my answer is I never give it a second thought, and there is only one answer, and that is, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. That is the only answer. I never look over my shoulder, and I never lose 1 minute's sleep. And they know I'm out here. Now, perhaps it's something Mahatma Gandhi said a number of years back. He made a statement that says, first, they ignore you. Second, they try to ridicule you. Third, they try to stop you. And fourth, you win. I guess I'm in the first phase. They're ignoring me right now. But of the recent presidents since Eisenhower, they've all been members of the secret groups except John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush. However, George W. Bush was a member of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale University. Now, every director of the Central Intelligence Agency has been a member of these secret groups. In fact, John Deutsch was a member of all three groups. And every Secretary of Defense has been a member. Donald Rumsfeld, our present Secretary of Defense, attended at least 2 Bilderberg meetings, and that's in my book. But you can see Robert Strange McNamara was a member of all three secret groups, and the Vietnam War was called McNamara's War. And in his book and several times on television in public appearances, he has stated that, in all honesty, he could have and should have stopped the Vietnam War 4 or 5 years before it did. But he didn't have the power or the courage or whatever it was to confront the insiders. He didn't say the insiders, but he said I couldn't confront them and say that we needed to stop it. But he was really talking about the international bankers who make money off of wars. They finance both sides of wars. They made lots of money off the Vietnam War and did not want it to stop. They didn't care one hoot whether people were killed or maimed or all the horrible things that happened to them there. They were in their ivory towers counting the money, and that's all they cared about. Now, the State Department, they absolutely control the State Department because that's where foreign policy is made. General Colin Luther Powell is a member of Bilderberg's and Council of Foreign Relations. Now, when you go in the book to the listing where I list everybody that's ever attended a Bilderberg meeting, the only person that has attended every Bilderberg meeting is a fellow named David Rockefeller. The person that has attended the most meetings after David is a fellow named Henry Kissinger. He's David Rockefeller's left-hand man, and Henry is a member of all three secret groups. He really controls the commerce in China. If you want to do business in China, you must go through Kissinger and Associates. So you've got some really evil people involved in the inner circle of these secret groups. And they go back all the way to probably Woodrow Wilson. They like to control the Treasury Department. There's only the current person, Paul H. O'Neill, that's Secretary of the Treasury, is not a member of the secret group, but within a year he will be a member. That's just the way it works. United Nations, every UN ambassador except 2 in recent years have been members of these secret groups. This is more within the United Nations. back to their point of foundation, they've been controlled. They also control the House of Representatives in our government. Thomas S. Foley was a member of all three secret groups. He was Speaker of the House. The one that took his place was Newt Gingrich. One day, a TV reporter on camera asked Newt if he was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and sort of caught him off guard. He said, "Oh, well, yes, I am. You know, back at one time, that was probably a very dangerous group, but today it's just a place where college professors go to read their newspapers and smoke their cigars and have meaningful discussions with their friends." Now, if he'd have said anything different from that or more than that, he would have been kicked out of the Council of Foreign Relations because of that bylaw. You see, Lee Hamilton has been a member of all three secret groups. Lee is a very docile appearing person, but he cannot be docile if he is a member of these all three groups. And that's more in the House of Representatives. They also control the U.S. Senate. Hillary Rodham Clinton, the new senator from New York, I told you earlier she attended Bilderberg meeting in Georgia. John Chaffee is another fairly docile appearing person, member of all three secret groups. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he seems to be a very nice fella, but he's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, I wouldn't have thought that we've talked about the executive and legislative groups. I didn't think they would control the judicial, but there are three sitting associate justices of the Supreme Court that are members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, the last time there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court, the news media published a short list of the 5 people that were considered to be the next sitting justice. Every one of those 5 were members of the Council of Foreign Relations. There was no outsider at all included. Now, in President George W. Bush's term of office, because of age, at least 2 sitting justices will retire. That'll give him an opportunity to put 2 more people on the Supreme Court. And if you look at history, there's a 99.9% chance that the next 2 sitting justices will be members of the Council of Foreign Relations. That'll give them absolute control of the Supreme Court. Now, why would they want to control the Supreme Court? Now, let's say that if I were lucky enough to file a suit against an organization and the Bilderbergs or Council of Foreign Relations Trilateral Commission were involved, and it finally got up to the Supreme Court, guess which way they would lean? Do you have any doubt? Now, they could not do what they want to do unless they absolutely control the news media. I have pages and pages of people in newspapers and news magazines, but the people that are known by almost everyone are those on television, so let's just look at those. Primarily the anchors, David Brinkley is a member, Peter Jennings, Diane Sawyer. Now, Diane Sawyer is not only a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, but she's a member of their board of directors. Gary Cutley, Barbara Wawa Walters, George Will, Leslie Stahl and Ed Bradley of 60 Minutes, Marvin Cab, Dan Rather, Roland Evans, Jesse Louis Jackson, Bernard Cab, Frank Sesno, Carl T. Rowan, Tom Brokaw, John Chancellor, Elizabeth Drew, Irving R. Levine, and Jim Lair. And Bill Moyers is not only a member of the Bilderbergs, but is a member of the CIA. Now, when Lyndon Johnson was sworn into office on Air Force One, that plane was held on the ground for over an hour waiting for Bill Moyers to come get on that plane to fly back to Washington. They wouldn't do that for just the average reporter, I assure you. They also, for some reason, have a need to get involved in charities and racial groups and religion. And the late Joseph Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago was a member. Elaine Chao, president of United Way, is a member. Benjamin Hooks, Hooks, the executive director of the NAACP, John Jacobs, president CEO of the National Urban League. They also control the labor unions. Again, people just send me information, and I have a list of every member of the CIA in one particular year. I believe it was 1986. And on that list is a fellow named George Meany. George Meany was not a member of one of the three secret groups, but it was a member of the CIA. Was president of the AFL-CIO from 1955 to 79. The fellow took his place. Lane Kirkland became president of the AFL-CIO from 79 to 95. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. And his secretary-treasurer all during his term of office was Tom Donahue, who was also a member of the same groups. You have Leonard Woodcock, president of the United Auto Workers Union. Now, if you wonder why they're dumbing down our kids, the Albert Shanker is a member of the Trilateral Commission, president of the American Federation of Teachers Unions. Now, if you go to a clothing store and look at the labels of all the clothes on the rack, probably 90% of them are made in China. The rest of them are made in Central America or South America or Ceylon or some very low-income country. And you'd wonder why the unions allowed all these jobs to leave this country. Now, here's maybe the reason. Jay Mazur is president of the United Union of Needleworkers, Trade, Industrial, and Textile Employees. He's president, and also Jack Shankman is president of the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. Now, I would think that their job is to protect American jobs. Apparently, they didn't do a very good job. Now, what are they striving for? They want to create a global union. Now, they started with the 15 sovereign nations of Western Europe. In 1992, they amalgamated into a group called the European Economic Community. And in the year 2000, they changed that name to the European Union. And the only thing that needs to be complete is for Great Britain and one of the Scandinavian countries to adopt a single currency, and then they will all be the same. They no longer require visas or passports to go from one nation to the other within the European Union. There's one central bank located in Frankfurt, Germany. By the coincidence, that's where the first central bank that we patterned after was located. That's where the Rothschilds set up their first central bank. So is it strange that the central bank of the European Union would be located in Frankfurt? They have one governing body, the Parliament of the European Union, one set of laws. Last year they started their own military force. When it's up to strength, then there'll no longer be a need for NATO. Now, the European Union is a pattern for the next areas that they will adopt, and the next one is called the American Union. Several years ago, they created what they call NAFTA, made up of Canada, United States, and Mexico. That will be expanded. The first nation to be included very likely will be Chile, and followed shortly thereafter by the other nations, Venezuela, Brazil, and others. Several years ago, David Rocca founded an agency called Council of the Americas, made up of members of every nation of North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean islands. By the year 2005, they will change the name then to the American Union. Now, I'm quoting things that not off the top of my head, but directly out of a document called Global Governance, published by the United Nations. And they'll tell you all this themselves, and it's in their timeline. Now, no dictator has ever been able to take over a nation without first outlawing private ownership of firearms. Yes. Now, I have told people from time to time that Australia has outlawed the private ownership of firearms, and when a lot of the people I tell it to say, oh, no, that cannot be true, you're lying, because Australia was populated by hardened criminals. That was a penal colony for the United Kingdom. And so the people there, their descendants from these hardened criminals would not allow their government to take their firearms. A couple of years ago, a fellow supposedly went berserk and killed 37 people with an AK-47. They quickly outlawed the private ownership of firearms, gave their citizens 2 years to turn in their guns, but they said they would buy the guns. And I spoke at the Nexus conference in Sydney, Australia last year, and the publisher of Nexus magazine is a friend of mine, and I asked him if how many people he thought turned in their weapons in Australia, and he said, oh, maybe a third, because we know that someday we may have to defend ourselves against our governments as well as yours. So the year 2005 is 3 years and just under 2 months away. They're going to have to really hook it up in order to make that schedule, but these are relentless people. They will jump on anything, like the New York and the Washington catastrophes, to tighten up our laws, to use the excuses to eventually register our firearms, then take our firearms, and then send us to prison if we don't turn them in, or if they find one on us and we don't have a permit. The next region is called the Asian Union. It's made up of 16 sovereign nations of the Pacific Rim. In 1994, an organization was founded called the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, made up of those nations. Their goal is to convert that into the Asian Union by the year 2010. Now, somewhere between 2010 and 2015, they'll move into the last union called the Soviet Union, and it's made up of 32 sovereign nations that was then formed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and it's scheduled to become the Soviet Union between 2010 and 2015, but this time not under communist control, but under direct control of the elite. Now let's get into the book, The Elite Serial Killers of Lincoln, JFK, RFK, and MLK. I start way back in the year 650 AD. There was a region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and north of the Caucasus Mountains, part of southern Russia today, called the Khazar, area of Khazar, K-H-A-Z-A-R. Their leader was called Kagan or Kagan, K-H-A-G-A-N, and they were nomads, primarily from Mongolia, and made up of Huns and people from the steppes of Russia. They finally settled down, and the leaders of Russia at that time came to this Kagan, or sent him word, and said that we want you and your tribe to take up the Orthodox religion of Russia. Well, he thought, being he was the leader, that he would use his own initiative, and he called in the leaders of all the religions that practiced in that region and asked them to give him a pitch about the advantages of being in their religion. When he got through, he settled on Judaism. He told all of his tribal members that they were now to worship the Jewish religion, Judaism. All the men were circumcised, and from then on they practiced Judaism. Now, I bring this up because I was on a talk show in Toronto several months ago, and I was talking about the Rothschilds and their efforts to try to control the world. And it was a call-in show, and a fellow called and he said, why do you allow anti-Semite like your guest to be on your program? And my answer was, I have not said anything anti-Semitic. I am not anti-Semitic. In fact, my personal assistant in my business, and my personal best friend is a Semitic Jew. So I would not hire that person or have that person as one of my best friends if I were anti-Semitic. And so he hung up. Now, I bring up the Khazars were overrun by Genghis Khan and several other marauders in those days, and finally they were scattered out. The area of Khazar was included into some of the surrounding nations. The people that were Khazarian Jews at that time went into Russia and into Western Europe. And the reason I go into the Khazarian Judaism is because the Rothschilds and most of the international bankers are Khazarian Jews. They're not Semitic Jews. And the Khazarian Jews are not descendants of Shem. They are not members of the 12 tribes of Israel. They're simply a group of people that in 640 decided to become Jews. That's all they are. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Khazarian Judaism or Semitic Judaism or any other religion. I'm just giving some facts that might be interesting to you. Now, the first family to be called Rothschild, back in 1744, there was a fella that had a goldsmith shop in a building. There was a 3-story building. He and his family lived on the 2nd and 3rd floor, and his place of business was on the 1st floor. It was a goldsmith shop. His name was Bauer, and his eldest son was Meyer Amschel Bauer. When he was about 15 or 16 years of age, he went to work in the Oppenheimer Bank and quickly learned the art of money. And he stayed with them a couple of years and then finally went back to Frankfurt and joined his father in his business, only he took up his products were rare coins and collectibles. And so when a member of the royal family would come in to buy a rare coin, for example, he'd say, well, being you're a member of the royal family, I'll give you a 10-15% discount. Now, send your friends in. And after a while, he'd say, if you'll introduce me to your finance minister on the king's staff, then I'll give you another bonus. And then when he got in contact with the finance minister, he said, if every time the king needs money, if you'll borrow it from me, I'll give you a kickback. And also from about 1760 on, well, let me step back. In those days, almost everyone was illiterate. And so if you wanted to go up to a place of business, you went to a symbol over the door, beside the door. There might be a fish or a deer's head or a sword or a sailing ship or something like that. Over the door in front of the building owned by the Bears was a simple red sign. In German, that is pronounced Rothschild or Rothschild. Some people say that Rothschild or Rothschild translates into red shield. That's not true. My German partner, I asked that specific question, and his comment was, it simply means red sign. So as people would have a need for some gold trinket, they would go to this building, look for the red sign, and as they walked in the door, they'd say, is this the house of Rothschild? Or is this the place where the red sign is where I can buy gold products? It didn't take long for the elder Bayer to drop the name Bayer and acquire the name Rothschild. So the first son to be called Rothschild was Meyer Amschel Bayer Rothschild. He had 5 sons and 7 daughters. In those days, and it could be true today, but when there was an inheritance, the daughters of the family never got anything. It always went to the sons. and the eldest son was always in charge of the family. Meyer Amschel Bayer schooled his 5 sons in the art of money, and when they were of age and had learned a trade, he sent them out to the financial capitals of Western Europe and set up their own central banks with headquarters there in Frankfurt. And that's how the name the name Rothschild got started. I told you they financed all wars. There was a newspaper called the Labor Leader, published on December 19th, 1891, on the subject of the Rothschilds. And in case you can't read it, I'll read it for you. It says, "This blood-sucking crew has been the cause of untold mischief and misery in Europe during the present century, and piled up its prodigious wealth chiefly through fomenting wars between states which ought never to have quarreled. Wherever there is trouble in Europe, wherever rumors of war circulate and men's minds are distraught with fear of change and calamity, you'll be sure that a Rothschild is at his game somewhere near the region of the disturbance." So they knew back then that they financed all wars. They financed the French Revolution, they financed the Bolshevik Revolution, World War I, World War II. In fact, they made a big pile of money when Napoleon was at Waterloo. Back in those days, the Rothschilds had the finest intelligence organization in the world. And so they had a spy overlooking the Battle of Waterloo. And in London at the stock exchange, they had bonds that they called consols. But the price of the console was based on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. And if Napoleon had won, that meant the power of Europe would be in the hands of the French. If he lost, the power would be in the hands of the Great Britain. So the people trading on the stock exchange were betting one way or another, and Nathan Rothschild had his usual post there on the floor, and so his spy could see that Napoleon was fixing to lose. So he got on his speedy horse and rode to the coast, got on a fast sailing ship, sailed over to England, got on another speedy horse, rode to London, told Nathan that Napoleon was fixing to lose the war. Now the people on the stock exchange were always trying to break Nathan's code. He would use signals. And so he gave a signal, maybe flipped an ear or something, and everybody thought that meant either buy or sell. Well, they figured out then that in fact, there was a statement made that probably Napoleon won, and so the price of consols went to the bottom. And when they got down to about a nickel on the dollar of their former value, Nathan gave another signal. All of a sudden, his agents on the floor bought up all the consols, and 10 hours later, the news came through that Napoleon had lost. The price of consols skyrocketed to the ceiling. When they hit the peak, the Rothschilds sold out, and so this was very common. They controlled everything. In fact, every morning of the week at 9 o'clock, there's a company called N.M. Rothschild, Nathan Meyer Rothschild, that happens to be located in the city of London, and they, every morning at 9 o'clock, they establish the price of gold worldwide. Now, if they set the price of gold, can you imagine that they tell their agents around the world that we're going to raise the price or we're going to lower the price, and so they buy and sell based on this insider information? You bet they do. Let's talk about the War of Independence when the United States decided to split from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much. The Rothschilds had been trying to set up a central bank in United States, and at one time they were granted a 20-year charter. When that expired, they failed to renew that charter, and but they were having troubles setting up their central bank, and so the Rothschilds formed a group. They were great at forming secret groups. In this case, they formed a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle quickly spread all across the United States, and in fact, all the members of the Confederate government were members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. All the members of Lincoln's cabinet were Knights of the Golden Circle except Lincoln and Secretary of Treasury. So the object was for the Knights of the Golden Circle to spread out, to split the United States in half, and then have it quarrel, and then finally go to war. And when the North and South had killed off as many soldiers as they could, or ran out of ammunition, or all their guns were used up, and both the North and South were heavily in debt, the Rothschilds had convinced the British government to put an army in Canada and another one in Mexico, and convinced the French and Spanish governments to put armies in Mexico. And when the United States was at its weakest point and heaviest in debt, these armies would then come in and take over the United States and bring it back under the control of the Crown. Well, Lincoln saw this coming. He contacted the Tsar of Russia and asked for his help. The Tsar of Russia quickly agreed. He sent part of his navy to anchor off the shore of New York City, part to anchor off the Gulf of Mexico, and the other to anchor off of the coast of California. And he notified the British, the French, and the Spanish if their troops crossed the borders into the United States, that Russia was going to take the side of the North and do battle with all those nations. Well, this kept them out. And Lincoln needed money to finance the war. And in those days, his only source was Nathan Rothschild in London, who was charging 24 to 36% interest on the money. And so he went to the Secretary of Treasury and told the Secretary of Treasury to print about $4.4 million worth of paper money. They called them greenbacks because the backs were green. And they put this in circulation to pay federal debt, and was accepted as a monetary exchange, and became very successful. And the Rothschilds saw this happening, and they could not allow any nation, particularly a fledgling nation like the United States, to establish their own money and credit. So they took one of the Knights of the Golden Circle spies, a fellow named John Wilkes Booth. He was first assigned to kidnap Lincoln. That failed, so he then decided to kill Lincoln. And so I'll get to that when I get to Lincoln. But I talked about the five Rothschild sons. They set up banks in Western Europe. Amschel went to Frankfurt, or stayed in Frankfurt with the old man. Nathan went to London, Jacob to Paris, Carl to Naples, and Solomon to Vienna. Now, there's the phenomena of the city of London. That's the city it means something. The Vatican happens to be a sovereign nation that is just located within Rome and Italy. It's sovereign. It's not part of Rome. It's not part of Italy. Likewise, the city of London is a sovereign nation of 577 acres of land, and it's at one time was completely surrounded by a rock wall. It has a police force of about 6,000. The total population is about 5,500. Now, the reason they have all those police is that's where the financial centers of the world are centered. That's where the Lloyd's of London is located. It's where the Bank of England is located, the Central Bank of England. The large trading companies have headquarters there. The largest insurance companies in the world have headquarters there. Every bank that deals in the United Kingdom has a branch bank there. And the large police force is there to protect their money. Now, if the Queen of England wants to cross through the city of London or go into the city for some reason, her assistants notify the mayor of the city of London, who meets her at the boundary. He escorts her to where she wants to go, because that is a state visit, one nation to another. When she's through, he escorts her out. And so that's where the elite, the core of the world's finances, that is their nation. Now, I mentioned the Queen of England. In about 1830 or so, she gave the East Indian Company a sole monopoly to pick up opium in India and deliver it to China, and to hook the Chinese peasants on opium. Well, when the Chinese rulers would protest, the British Navy would conveniently anchor off the coast and start bombarding. And it actually led to two wars they call the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1842. So you have the Queen of England directly involved in the dealing of opium. It's my belief that all of the elite, the inner core, are directly involved in the sale of illicit drugs worldwide, and certainly in the laundering of the money from illicit drugs. Now let's get into Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was shot at 10:15 p.m. on April the 14th, 1865, died the next day at 7:22 a.m. He and his wife and Clara Harris and Henry Rathbone were sitting in the president's box in the Ford Theater to see the play Our American Cousin. John Wilkes Booth, at the first intermission, got to chatting with the guard. There was a single guard named Parker outside of Lincoln's booth, and he was there to guard Lincoln, but John Wilkes Booth asked him to go join him at the saloon next door and have a drink, and he left enough money on the table for that guard to spend the night, rest of the evening drinking, and he never returned to his post. John Wilkes Booth then went up to the state box, opened the back door, shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a single-shot Derringer, jumped down to the stage below, broke a bone in his foot, but limped across the stage. He pulled his long knife and to keep people away from him, and he escaped out the back door. He and his companion rode their horses out of town and through the countryside, and ended up at a tobacco farm. And they were hiding out in a tobacco warehouse. Well, the soldiers followed them there. And so the soldiers were in front of the barn, and they said, if you don't come out, we're going to shoot you and we're going to burn the barn down. Well, the soldiers thought there were just two people in the barn. Actually, there were three. John Wilkes Booth snuck out the back door, got on his horse, rode to the river nearby, got on a British ship, sailed to London. By the way, when he killed Lincoln, he had in his possession $6,800 in cash. He was an out-of-work actor. About 3 weeks before he killed Lincoln, he was in London to pick up his money from either the Rothschilds or agents of the Rothschilds. And so he sailed to London. From there, he probably picked up his retirement money and sailed to Bombay, India, where he spent the next 14 years, died of natural causes 14 years after he killed Lincoln. Now, the person that killed Lincoln, they got these two soldiers that they'd shot, and the one they called, John Wilkes Booth had red hair. Booth had raven black hair. And there's a lady named Izola Forrester that wrote a book. She happened to be John Wilkes Booth's granddaughter. She had a desperate need to know the truth about her grandfather. So she did heavy research for a number of years and wrote a book, a 500-page book on the subject. And I have a copy of that book, and that's where my Lincoln information comes from. And I'm convinced that that's real fact. She found a number of witnesses that said the person killed and went into John Wilkes Booth's grave had red hair. And many other witnesses, and of course she knew that her grandfather had black hair. And that'd be a simple thing if they exhume that body and do a DNA test, and I'm sure Izola Forrester has living relatives. They could prove that real quick if anyone cared. No one cares.
That's right.
Now, why did they kill Lincoln? Because the main reason, he created the greenbacks. And if that would have been successful, all the other nations of the world would have thought that was great, so they'd print their own money and put the Rothschilds out of business. And so they couldn't stand that, so they had Lincoln killed. Now, Secretary Chase printed about $450 million worth of greenbacks, and I'll talk about that again when I get to JFK. Before we get into JFK, let's talk about CIA and mind control. Right after World War II, both the Russians and the U.S. government were very interested in acquiring the German scientists, particularly the rocket scientists and aerospace engineers. They also were very interested in picking up the German doctors that were heavily involved in mind control experimentation. And so there's a fellow named John J. McCloy that at that time was High Governor of Germany. And so for these 760 of these Nazi scientists finally came into the United States, but they had to first submit resumes along with a request for a visa. All the first requests with their real history on it were rejected. So John J. McCloy and his staff took all these resumes, they whitewashed them, resubmitted them, and everybody was approved to be an immigrant. This was on Operation Paperclip by the CIA. Now, the CIA used hypnosis. They used all sorts of mind-controlled drugs like Rohypnol and scopolamine and LSD. They used stun guns, cattle prods, sleep, food, and light deprivation. They would then take a person and tape their eyelids open and expose them to high-intensity light. They would expose them to high-intensity sound. And all of these traumatic events were designed to make the person into a robot. And this really went on. In fact, there were Senate hearings in 1977 about these experiments, and the then director of the CIA was present at those hearings, and they asked him, they said, we would like all the documentation on the mind control experiments, and the director said, I'm sorry, all the records were destroyed in 1975. Well, nobody was fired over it, nothing happened about it. Now, I was curious about getting records from the CIA, and a friend of mine told me, again, just as I needed something, a friend said, all you got to do is send a $35 check and a letter of request to Freedom of Information to the CIA, and they'll send you 3 CDs in a set. So I wrote the letter, sent the check, received the 3 CDs, and started going through the documents and found over 20,000 documents directly related to the mind-controlled experimentation. One of those documents had to do with taking a person, and through all of the trauma, they wanted to see if they could take a foreigner and make that person into a robot and have them kill a world leader. Now, down at the bottom of this document, and this document is in my book, in handwriting, and I'll have to paraphrase it, it says something like, "This looks very interesting, we may need this later," and then initials right under it. In 1962, there was a movie made called The Manchurian Candidate. The theme of that movie was that an American soldier would be captured by the North Koreans, brainwashed, and under hypnosis told that they could go back to the United States, and at some point in time they would receive a phone call. During this phone call, the person on the other end of the line would give them a trigger. A trigger would be some word like a rose or something like that. When that trigger was said, that person would immediately go into a hypnotic trance, would go get his weapon and go kill the President of the United States. That was the theme of the movie. I'm convinced that the killers of JFK, RFK, and MLK were all under mind control by the CIA, and I'll cover that again later. But this Operation Artichoke is where they tried to create this Manchurian Candidate. Let's get into quickly a fellow named John J. McCloy. Now, you're going to hear that name again several times, so it'll become very familiar to you. He was a puppet to the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. In fact, he was a son of a single-parent family, so his mother had to work, and he went to Harvard. He had to work while he was going to Harvard to earn his tuition. And so one of the jobs he had as a tutor was to tutor the Rockefeller boys, brothers, in the art of sailing and several other subjects. So that was his first exposure to the Rockefellers. He remembered them, they remembered him. He got his degree from Harvard in law, went on to work for a prestigious law firm in New York City. And later, early in 1947, in 46, he was instrumental in forming the OSS, which later became the CIA in 1947, under the 1947 National Security Act. That same act exempted the CIA from civil and criminal prosecution for any reason. So the CIA can do anything, and they do not have to pay the price. So John J. McCloy became chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, and at the same time was chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. And when the OPEC nations, primarily of the Middle East, but a couple of South American countries, decided they wanted to determine the production rate and the price of oil, they formed OPEC. And the Seven Sisters were the 7 spin-off companies when Standard Oil of New Jersey was split up because the Sherman Antitrust Act. John D. Rockefeller owned 78% of the oil business at that time. Well, they formed 7 companies, but the Rockefellers still own those 7 companies. Well, it was against the Sherman Antitrust Act for the heads of several companies to get together to either determine price or production or anything else on one particular product or service. So they called on John J. McCloy to represent them at the OPEC nations. He did agree to allow them to raise the price of oil, but they had to deposit all the profits above $5 a barrel in the banks in New York City. And so now you know where they get their money. Now these 7 sisters still exist, and they operate under the same exemption from Sherman Antitrust Act as it was done in the OPEC first agreement. Now, John J. McCloy, as he represented the Seven Sisters, it was against the Sherman Antitrust Act for the groups, any heads of corporations to get together to sell the same product or service to collude against the customers or sources. And so John Jay went to the Attorney General at the time and got special permission to exclude he and the executives of the 7 oil companies to get together and negotiate with the OPEC nations. That exclusion remains in effect today. If you wonder why the price of gasoline or oil or whatever goes up and down all together, you know that they plan all of this. They establish regions. It's all it's just still a grand monopoly. They just do it under 7 or maybe it's 5 names by now because there's been some consolidation. But as John J. McCloy was negotiating with the OPEC nations, let's say that the price of oil was $5 a barrel. He told them that he would allow the OPEC nations to increase the price of oil, but every penny above $5 a barrel would go into a 30-year CD, certificate of deposit, in the major banks in New York City, primarily Chase Manhattan Bank, Morgan Guaranty Trust, Citibank. And so as they have sold billions and billions of barrels of oil, they've collected gazillions of dollars over and above that $5 a barrel, and all this went into these CDs and the major banks. And there's a banking practice called, it's a reserve practice, which says that each bank must retain 10% of their capital in reserve against bad loans or whatever, but they can loan 90% of the capital out at interest. But you can imagine this gazillions of dollars deposited in these banks. Now there's another phenomena that, let's take an example that if this city has only one bank and they loan $1,000 to a person and they don't really need it, so they deposit in a savings account in this bank, and then the bank then can take $900 of that $1,000 and loan it out again, and they loan it to someone that doesn't need it, so they put it in a safety deposit box or savings account in that same bank, and then the bank can loan 90% of that out, and so on and on and on until they get to the last dollar. So this one act of depositing $1,000 can create $9,000 in new money. So if you take a gazillion dollars that earned by the OPEC nations times 9, that's $9 gazillion that these banks can loan out at interest, and they create money out of thin air. And now you understand why they're in the banking business. Now let's get into Lyndon Baines Johnson, the news media, Texas, Dallas, and the Johnson private lawyer. Lyndon Baines Johnson was directly responsible for murdering over 12 people in the state of Texas. And I've got 12 listed here, and I'll cover some of them, not all of them. But he would go to Cliff Carter and tell Carter who he wanted killed, and Mac Wallace was his #1 shooter. And Mac Wallace would just go down and kill him or poison him or whatever it took to do it. But let's talk about the first person, a fellow named Henry Marshall. Henry Marshall worked for the Agriculture Department, and he got a wind of a kickback scheme and a scam that Billy Saul Estes had worked up, where he was involved in cotton allotments. And so Henry Marshall also found out that Billy Saul Estes was kicking back to Lyndon Johnson and was fixing to blow the whistle. So Lyndon simply told Cliff Carter to send Mac to Texas. So Mac Wallace came down to Texas, followed Henry Marshall out on his farm. Now the official story is that Henry Marshall stopped his truck got out and put a hose in the exhaust pipe, put it in the cab and rolled the window up, and got in there and breathed the exhaust fumes for a while, and that wasn't doing the job, so he whacked himself on the head, and so he got out and said Shazam, and the hose disappeared, and he took a .22 bolt-action rifle off the gun rack in the cab and held it out his arm length and shot himself 5 times in the side with a bolt-action rifle. And the coroner verdict was he died of suicide. And it took the Marshall family a year to ever have that investigated, and they had a hearing. By then, Lyndon Johnson was dead, Cliff Carter was dead, Mac Wallace was dead. They, in the hearing, Billy Saul Estes appeared and under immunity stated that Johnson had Carter call Mac Wallace, and Mac Wallace is the one that did the shooting. And so they changed the cause of death on the death certificate from suicide to homicide, but the killers were dead, and so nothing was done of it. The next person on the list is John Douglas Kinzer. Doug Kinzer was pro at a pitch and putt golf course in Austin at one of the parks. Well, Mac Wallace's wife had left him and gone to Austin and to live with her mother. And Doug Kinzer was sleeping with Mac Wallace's wife. He was also sleeping with a lady named Josepha Johnson, who was Lyndon Johnson's sister. Well, Doug Kinzer was trying to get some special favors out of Johnson through his sister, and didn't take much to make Johnson mad, so he sent Mac Wallace down there to take care of the case. And he walked into the pro shop, Mac Wallace did, pulled out his semi-automatic pistol, shot Doug Kinzer 5 times, stuck the pistol in his pocket, walked out and got in his Pontiac and drove away. And there were 5 witnesses there in the pro shop, and they wrote down his license number, and the police caught Mac Wallace out on Highway 290 and brought him back in and put him under arrest. He immediately got on the phone and got a hold of Johnson. Johnson called John Coffer, his private attorney. Coffer showed up. They had a very quick trial. Mac Wallace was found guilty of murder in first degree. The judge gave the verdict, the sentence as 6 months suspended sentence. Mac Wallace got in his car and drove away and went back to Washington, back to his job. Johnson controlled not only John Coffer, but the district attorney and the judge. It's just the way it worked. The next person on the list is a black lady named Dale Turner. There's a lady named Madeline Duncan Brown wrote a book titled Texas in the Morning. Madeline Brown was Lyndon Johnson's mistress for 21 years, gave birth to his only known son, and she wrote a book afterward about this affair called Texas in the Morning. And but Madeline had a son by her husband who she had divorced, and then the son by Johnson. And when Johnson was in Texas, they would always reserve a room in the hotel where Johnson was supposed to stay next door to Johnson's room for Dale Turner and the boys to stay at while Madeline was with Johnson. Well, in this one particular occasion, Madeline knocked on Lyndon's door, and he came to the door and grabbed her and hugged her and picked her up and was swinging around, and as he turned, he saw Dale Turner looking him right in the eye as she was trying to herd the boys into the room. And so Dale quickly slammed the door. Johnson took Madeline into the room, slammed the door, and says, "Kiss that woman goodbye." Madeline says, "Now wait a minute, Dale she's sort of part of our family. She's been the nanny for my 2 sons for 10 years. And he said, I don't care, kiss her goodbye. And Madeline hoped that he would forget that, but 2 weeks later, Madeline was at work and got a phone call from Dale, and Dale said, emergency's come up, I need to take a day or two off, but I'll be back. And Madeline said, well, just take the boys over to my mother's house, she'll take care of them until you get back, and I hope everything's okay, and I'll see you when you get back. And it was last she saw of Dale Turner. Madeline was talking to Cliff Carter several years later, and she said, you know, I often wondered what happened to Dale. And Cliff said, oh, you didn't know Lennon had Mac Wallace killed Dale. He couldn't stand, he thought maybe she might tell everybody that we were together. And it was just that simple. Next one on the list is a lady named Josepha Johnson. I mentioned her earlier. Josepha Johnson was Lyndon Johnson's sister. She was an alcoholic. She had been to alcohol treatment centers a number of times, was never successfully cured. One of the things she'd do while drunk, she would tell about Lyndon's affairs and his business, and Johnson kept telling her to keep her. Johnson controlled, when he was in the Senate, he controlled the Senate, he controlled the House of Representatives. Very powerful person, and his theory was he would help someone do whatever they wanted to do as long as he got his cut, and it was normally 10%. And it was in cash, never in check. And Madeline also said that during that time in Dallas, if you wanted someone beat up, it might cost you $5 or $10. If you wanted them killed, it might cost as high as $100. And nobody would investigate it, and they just ought to be killed. That's just where it was. Now, Johnson's lawyer, John Coffer, represented Johnson at the famous Box 13 investigation, where the first office for federal government position that Johnson ran for was for Congress. And in Duval County, all the votes were in Johnson's favor, and except in Box 13 contained the votes that would have made Johnson lose, which would have made him lose that election. And for some reason, that Box 13 disappeared, never to be found. Madeline asked Lyndon one day, he says, Lyndon, what was in Box 13? And he said, Madeline, it's the same thing that's going to be in the records of JFK assassination. There's nothing in those records. And the record's supposed to be released about year 2037 or something like that. But Coffer represented Johnson in the Box 13 scandal. He also represented Billy Saul Estes when Billy Saul had a bunch of fertilizer tanks. And he thought it would be neat to mortgage those tanks. In fact, he would take one tank and mortgage it with maybe 10 or 15 different banks. And got caught and went to trial. But he was kicking back to Johnson, and Coffer was there to make sure that Johnson's name did not come up and that Billy Saul went to prison without uttering the name Johnson. Billy did go to prison, but John Coffer represented him and made sure he pled guilty. Now, Billy Saul's daughter, Pamela, wrote a book titled Billy Saul. And in that book, she said, most people, when they're going to trial, they want to make sure that they have an impartial jury. What they really ought to be concerned with is that they go to trial where there's an impartial judge. Because you can take an impartial jury and the judge can swing that jury any way they want to, and they readily do that. John Coffer also represented Mac Wallace when he killed John Douglas Kinser, and that's how Mac got off so quickly. Now let's talk about President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was shot at 12:30 p.m. November 22nd, 1963 at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. The accused assassin by the Warren Commission was Lee Harvey Oswald, the sole shooter. Supposedly fired 3 shots from the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository building on the 6th floor, and was supposedly the only shot. Actually, there was a 15-person death squad made up of 1 woman and 14 men behind the picket fence at the grassy knoll. There were 2 shooters and 1 man on a walkie-talkie radio. One of the shooters behind the grassy knoll, as he was following the car, didn't notice the street sign, and when he pulled a trigger, it was lined up with a street sign, and it hit that street sign and ricocheted off. The other fired a shot that blew the top of Kennedy's head off from the grassy knoll. On the 6th floor, there were 3 men and 1 lady. The lady was a Hispanic lady about the age of 20. She was manning a radio. She had gone to Fort Worth to pick up an Indian who lived in Oklahoma City, east of Oklahoma City, and drove him down there because Mac Wallace had met him at a funeral for one of the congressmen that had died, and said that he may need his talents later. And so on the 6th floor there was Mac Wallace. His job was to shoot and kill Governor John Connally. The Indian was to shoot Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was on the 6th floor at the time of the shooting, but I'm convinced that he was directly under CIA mind control, and that they had fired the 3 shells out on a target range somewhere or just out in the woods, and had the 3 empty shell cases laying on the floor, had the rifle laying on the floor, and that Oswald was probably waiting over by the staircase. Just as soon as they started shooting, his job was to run down the steps and wait on the 2nd floor, get him a Coke, and just stand there. Because now if you recall, in the Olympics in Australia this year, that I believe the fellow was named Green, that was the fastest man in the world. He ran the 100-meter dash. When he completed the event, and he was way ahead of the 2nd fastest guy, he just trotted over to the TV camera and started talking to the reporter. Wasn't breathing hard, didn't seem to be sweating. He just was carrying on a normal conversation. He just finished the race of his life and did not show any signs that he'd just done that. Under hypnosis, you can create the same effect. You could have a person run down the steps to the 2nd floor to the employee lounge, and as the shots were fired, there's a motorcycle patrolman thought the shots came from the top of the building, so he parked his bike real quick, ran up the steps, and just as soon as he entered the building, he met the building manager. They started running up the steps, and when they got to the 2nd floor, they saw Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the Coke machine drinking a Coke in the employee lounge. Well, he wasn't breathing hard. He was just standing there casually, and so they ran on up, and so that was the last they saw of Lee Harvey Oswald until he casually just walked out of the building. Now, on the 2nd floor of the Dowtex building, behind the motorcade, there was 1 shooter and 1 radio operator. And on the top of the Dallas County Records building, there was 1 shooter and 1 radio operator. The shooter on the top of this records building happened to be a crack shot and was a member of the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. He was a deputy sheriff. He wasn't there to protect the president, but to help kill him. Okay, now on the 2nd floor of the Texas School Book Depository building was the command post. There were 4 men on the 2nd floor, in a closed room. One of them was Cliff Carter. He was manning the radio. He gave the orders to fire. Now, as the cars were going down the street, Lyndon Johnson was in a car 3 or 4 cars back behind JFK. Now, Ralph Yarborough was in that same car, and he told a friend of mine that he saw Lyndon up against the window, had a walkie-talkie up against his ear, listening to something. Well, he was listening for Cliff Carter to say, "Shoot." And within about 4 seconds time, 7 shots were fired. One of them, as I said earlier, blew the top of Kennedy's head off. Another one hit him in the back of the neck, came out his bow tie at a knot. Another shot from Mac Wallace went through Governor Conley's shoulder, through his thigh, and lay down on the ground of the car. In my book, I give you the names of all those shooters, exactly where they were standing, and a brief history of all those people. The only person still alive of that 15-person death squad is Ruth Ann, unless the elite have had her killed. And she's the only human being that can tell us whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald even had a gun in his hand that day. And I've recommended in the book that the Justice Department and the Dallas County DA and the Governor of Texas issue a notice to the public that anyone who has direct knowledge of those 3 killings, if they will come forward, they'll give them absolute immunity from prosecution. And that if anyone is in prison or who has ever been in prison has full knowledge and will testify in these deaths, that they will be given a pardon. And so far I haven't convinced the governor to do that. But there are probably at least a dozen people that are still alive that can testify in these cases. Now, the night before JFK was killed, there was a meeting at one of the wealthiest persons in the world's home in North Dallas. His name was Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison went into a lot of deals with a fellow named Sid Richardson, and they bought up a bunch of racetracks. They owned construction companies, oil businesses, all sorts of things. And one day they bought out one of the big railroads up in the east, and next morning one of them called in and said, "By the way, what was the name of that railroad we bought yesterday?" And they were very casual about their investments. But the meeting was at Clint's home. By then, Sid Richardson had died, so he was not there. The social event was supposed to be in behalf of J. Edgar Hoover, who was in town, and they were there to honor him. And so J. Edgar Hoover was there. The event started at 8 o'clock in the evening. Madeline Brown was there, the author of Texas in the Morning, and since she's become a dear friend of mine. She was Lyndon Johnson's mistress for 21 years, and he was, wherever he was scheduled to be, she was also invited. So she was invited to Clint Murchison's event. And about 9 o'clock, the front door opened, and Lyndon walked in and said, "Okay, men, it's time for our meeting." And 25 men got up and walked into the dining room. They closed the door. And now, I have 4 sources of this information that are still alive. One of those sources is a mafia associate that I told you earlier, when I need something, there it is. This person contacted me and said, I've heard about you, and I understand that you're a very honest person and that you're trying to collect information. And I know all about the JFK killing, and if you will keep my name private, I'll tell it all. And so I guaranteed that name will never be known. But this person was in the Clint Murchison meeting. He was also on the second floor of the Texas School Book Depository building when JFK was shot. So he's an eyewitness to both events. Madeline was there. She told me in her book she gives a couple of names of the people that were at that event. And right after I met her, someone sent me a copy of her book and said they're looking for an investor. And I read it and I said I'd like to. I'm interested in it. So I became a distributor of that book, and I wanted to meet the author, so I went to Dallas and met her, and so we had several discussions on it, and we became close friends. And so as time went on, she finally one day she said, Gaylon, I've known you long enough now that I know I can trust you, so I'm going to tell it all. And so she told all about the Clint Murchison event, and I have it on video, and probably sometime next month I'll make that video available. But other than the shooters I've talked about, there were at least a half dozen other killers in Dallas, and they were probably downstream from the Dealey in case they missed Kennedy in Dealey Square, that they were to shoot him later. But I have the names of those people in the book. Now, also, the day before Kennedy was killed, there was a meeting of Operation 40 at the Cabana Motel in Dallas. And Richard Milhouse Nixon headed up Operation 40, and the sole purpose of Operation 40 was an assassination squad that was set up to kill world leaders all over the world, and Nixon was put in charge of that. Jack Ruby happened to be at that same meeting. Now, I have a signed affidavit from the driver that picked Nixon up at Love Field, drove him to the Cabana Hotel. After that meeting was over, drove him to Clint Murchison's house, and so I have that evidence. E. Howard Hunt was there, Maritza Lorenz. These other people were CIA operatives. They were there to make sure everything was going all right. Down in Mexico, there was an operation called ZR Rifle, and that was near Mexico City, near Oaxaca, 320 miles southwest of Mexico City, and that's where they had assassination squads in camp there. That they did their rifle practice there, and they were just hanging out, waiting to go on call to go out and kill somebody. Among those was a leader named Patrice Lumumba, and several others were killed by this death squad. Now, I'll tell you a few of the members of the 25 that went in a secret meeting. One of them was a fellow that was High Governor of Mexico, of Germany. He became chairman of the board of the Council of Foreign Relations, became chairman of the board of Chase Manhattan Bank, and his name was John J. McCloy. You can't get any more elite than that. The fellow that took John J. McCloy's place as chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations and chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank was an unknown benign fellow called David Rockefeller. But you have the number one guy in the elite that answered directly to the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers was at this meeting, and the purpose of that meeting was to cover up the evidence and put out information about the death the next day. Now, I told you that Cliff Carter was running that meeting, and J. Edgar Hoover was in that meeting, and Cliff said, well, what about the evidence that comes up? And J. Edgar Hoover's comment was, all evidence in this case must come through the FBI. I got it wired. Don't worry about it. And another person that was in that private meeting was a fellow named Carlos Marcello. Carlos was head of the mafia in New Orleans, and over the mafia in several states in that region. So you have the head of the elite in the same room, sitting around the same table as the head of the FBI and the head of the local mafia, plotting to cover up the killing of the president the next day. And Jack Ruby was also in this meeting. I won't name the others. You need to buy the book to get the rest of them. But also guests at that event, I list all of those. Madeline Duncan Brown was there. I don't know whether I've said it yet, but when Johnson came out of that meeting, he walked over to Madeline, and she thought he was going to say, "I'll meet you at the hotel when I leave here," but what he really said was, "After tomorrow, that blankety blank Kennedy will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat, that's a promise." He said the same statement to her the next day over the phone before Kennedy was killed. Now, from the Murchison meeting, Johnson didn't go to a hotel with Madeline. Instead, he went to an all-night joint in Fort Worth called The Cellar. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Another person that was not included in the private meeting was Shirley Pauling. She was one of Jack Ruby's strippers. Another one was a lady named Val M. Dr. Brashear was one of the doctors in attendance of JFK at Parkland Hospital. Val M. later married Dr. Brashear. I have a copy of Val M.'s article that she wrote in the Dallas Morning News. She was social editor for Dallas Morning News. And in that article, she mentioned nothing about the Clint Murchison meeting or the social event or anything else. It was a very bland article. Gordon McClendon owned a number of radio stations, including one in Fort Worth and Dallas and several throughout Texas and neighboring states. Dick Cannizer and Don Newberry worked for Gordon McClendon in sales. Helen Thomas is the Helen Thomas that when there's a White House conference or a meeting, Helen Thomas is the representative from United Press International who always asks the first question. That is the Helen Thomas that was at the Clint Murchison meeting. She has never reported that in the United Press International. I live on a ranch west of Austin, and my ranch is for sale, and a real estate agent brought a fellow out one day to go through the ranch, and they were going through the house, and I was guiding him through, and as we went into the shipping office, he saw the books that I had on the bookshelf that I sell, and he said, "You have some very interesting books." And I said, "Well, some of them are kind of disturbing, but they're all fact." And he just said, "Well, I was there." And I said, "I'm sorry?" He said, "I was at the meeting." I said, "What meeting?" He said, "I was at the Clint Murchison meeting the night before JFK was killed." I quickly grabbed Lexdale Owens by the arm, and we went in the living room and sat down and had a long talk. And he told me the names of Philip Elliott, Ted W. Powers, and Dave Blair, who were also there representing the Associated Press. Neil Speltz and Cactus Pryor were either news commentators or reporters for KTBC Radio and later KTBC TV. Neil Speltz is still a news commentator for KI TV in Austin. He's still alive. Cactus Pryor is retired, but he's still alive. Frank Cormier was Helen Thomas's boyfriend at the time. He's since passed away. But there are 8 people still alive that were present at Clint Murchison's social event. And if I can get the governor and the Dallas DA and the attorney and the Justice Department to give immunity, there's probably at least a dozen people ready to come forward to testify. Now let's talk about the Warren Commission. 57% of the Warren Commission were members of the elite. And strange, we got John J. McCloy. He was at the Clint Murchison meeting plotting the cover-up of the death the next day. is it just odd that Lyndon Johnson appointed him to be a member of the Warren Commission? He was chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, very trusted person. Gerald R. Ford was there, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Allen W. Dulles was a member. Now, JFK fired him and all of the heads of the CIA after the famous Bay of Pigs fiasco. So Allen Dulles didn't have a high regard for JFK. Now, John S. Cooper was not only Bilderberg's and Council of Foreign Relations, but also a Skull and Bones member. And Hale Boggs and Earl Warren and Richard Russell were not members of the elite. Hale Boggs is Cokie Roberts' father, the female talking head on Sunday morning talk show. Hale Boggs, there was speculation he was fixing to dump on the real truth of the JFK killing, and he died in a plane crash in Alaska. They never found the airplane or any people in the airplane. Now, since then, in 1998, two guys got together and listened to all the audio tapes that JFK made in his office when he was on the phone or had visitors. There was an automatic taping system that taped all the conversations. Well, these two authors listened to all those tapes and wrote a book and essentially said there was nothing really important there. Well, strangely enough, both those guys are members of the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, about 3 days ago, I was watching TV, and this fellow named Michael Beschloff was talking about his book that he just published called The LBJ Tapes. Is it odd that he's also Council of Foreign Relations member? Strange things happen. Now, in Madeline's book, Texas in the Morning, she talks about an organization called the 8F Group, and that's simply the number of the hotel room in the Rice Hotel in Houston, Texas, where the big movers and shakers met to play poker and sort of plot against the rest of us. And one of those members was a fellow named John J. McCloy. Strange. Now, why did he kill JFK? The main reason is he signed Executive Order 11110 instructing the Treasury Department to print $4.3 billion worth of silver certificates in direct competition with the Federal Reserve and their Federal Reserve notes. That's the reason he was killed, the same reason that Lincoln was killed. You're messing with the Rothschilds and their money system. Now, there are several other reasons that a lot of people hated JFK and Bobby. JFK had already issued orders to start pulling the troops out of Vietnam, that it was a failed effort, and he said, let's bring it to a halt. Shortly after JFK was killed, Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order telling them not only to quit bringing the troops out, but to add to them, because the international bankers owned the military and industrial complex who made money off of wars. And Robert Strange McNamara said in his book and on TV several times that he could have stopped the Vietnam War 4 or 5 years ahead of time that it was, but he didn't have the courage to go up against the big boys. There's also evidence that JFK would have stopped the Cold War many years before it did. And there's also evidence that he was aware of the secret government that's really in charge, the shadow government. There's no person named Kennedy in the Kennedy clan that's ever been a member of the secret groups. They've been excluded because they were not trusted. And there's good evidence that JFK would have probably asked Congress to repeal the Federal Reserve Act because he'd already issued money in competition with them. He fired the heads of all of the CIA because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. He was going to, at the time of his death, J. Edgar Hoover was 72 years of age, and Kennedy was going to make him retire. The retirement age was 70, and he'd gone overboard, and so Kennedy was going to make him retire, and and Hoover didn't want to retire. Shortly after Johnson was sworn in, he signed an executive order saying that J. Edgar Hoover could be director of the CIA of the FBI as long as he wanted to. The Mafia was against both Kennedys because both Jack and Bobby were trying to put them all in prison. Now, one of the contributing factors to JFK winning the election was the Mafia in Chicago. And Joe had promised that if the Mafia in Chicago helped get him elected, that they would have an easy ride. Well, he was promising out of Joe's mouth. He wasn't promising out of Jack and Bobby's mouth, and so they didn't go through with that. So they were after him. Johnson also found out that he was going to be left off the ticket in the next election, and he desperately wanted to be president. And there's strong evidence that JFK would probably have apologized to Castro for the famous Bay of Pigs fiasco. In terms of security, there was no police officers assigned to protect JFK except the motorcycle patrolmen that were escorting the limousine. The sheriff's department only had one man there, and he wasn't there to protect but to kill JFK. And I name him in the book. Now, at this cellar that Johnson went to the night of the Murchison party in Fort Worth, almost all the members of the Secret Service were there, and they were given free drinks and free access to women till about 6 o'clock in the morning. So they were not in any condition to protect their president the next day when they should have. Now let's talk about Senator Attorney General Robert Francis Kennedy was shot at 12:15 p.m. June 5th, 1968 in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Bobby had been there to speak at a rally, and when it was over, he was supposed to go to a fundraiser nearby, and so the quickest way to get to that fundraiser was go through the kitchen and the pantry, and the hotel maitre d', Carl Euchre, had him by the hand, was pulling him through the crowd. When they went through the pantry, there's about 50 people in the pantry, so they had really had to weave their way through. And as they got to the steam tables, Carl Euchre was standing about like this, and he felt someone trying to get past him on the right, and he thought someone was trying to shake Bobby's hand, but all of a sudden, here came a pistol. Sirhan had an 8-shot Ira Johnson 22 caliber revolver, and he started firing it. Well, Bobby didn't have any bodyguards. He had one paid bodyguard named Kennedy, was not a relation, but he was not near Bobby at the time. But standing next to Euchre was Roosevelt Greer and Rayford Johnson. Rayford Johnson was a famous Olympic decathlon winner, black man, and Roosevelt Greer was a black tackle on one of the NFL football teams. Both of them really were strong guys. So when Sirhan started firing, Roosevelt grabbed the hand of Sirhan, started beating it against the steam table, and but Sirhan fired all 8 shots. 4 of them hit people in the crowd. The rest of the shots went into the woodwork or into the ceiling. None of them hit Bobby Kennedy. When Sirhan started firing, there was a fellow standing behind Bobby Kennedy named Thane Eugene Cesar. He was moonlighting with the Ace Security Service. During the daytime, he worked for an aerospace company there in Los Angeles. But both Sirhan and Thane Eugene Cesar were under CIA mind control. When Sirhan started firing, Cesar pulled his 9-shot 22 caliber revolver and started firing. One bullet went through the shoulder pad on Bobby's right shoulder, the jacket, didn't break the skin. The next shot hit him in the middle of the back. No, the second shot was under his armpit and came out his throat. The third shot was an inch behind his ear, and the muzzle of the gun was an inch from his head when it was fired. and all the rest of the shots went into the crowd or into the ceiling or into the woodwork. And I account for all 17 shots in my book that night. All right, now, before Bobby was in the pantry, a number of witnesses saw Sirhan standing off the side in the pantry drinking a cup of coffee with a lady in a polka dot dress. The lady in polka dot dress was there to put either scopolamine or rohypnol into Sirhan's coffee. Now those two drugs are amnesia-inducing drugs. Now every time you have surgery today, you're given, besides the painkiller, you're given a drug to give you amnesia during the time of the surgery. You still feel the pain, but this drug is to make you forget it. So this girl in the polka dot dress was to put one of these drugs in the coffee, and also to give Sirhan the trigger word, so he immediately would become a Manchurian candidate. She probably also contacted Thane Eugene Caesar for the same reason. Immediately after Bobby was shot, as I said, Roosevelt Greer had grabbed him, turned him over to the police, they handcuffed him, and the police said, "Why did you kill Bobby Kennedy?" He said, I guess I did. You say I did. I don't remember. Now, Bashir Sirhan is still alive in Soledad prison, and he is, ever since, has not been able to recall about a 40-minute span of his memory during that time of the killing. He's been under interview, under hypnosis a number of times, and he can recreate every second except for that short period of time. And they've never allowed him to have a second trial. Now, why did they kill Bobby? Johnson hated both Bobby and Jack. And Bobby was his opponent in the '68 presidential race, and probably a 99% chance that Bobby would have beat him out in that election. And Johnson still wanted to be president. Bobby probably knew most of the facts about his brother's death, but he was powerless. Even though he was Attorney General, he had no power over the FBI because J. Edgar Hoover was over the FBI. And I told you earlier, he said all evidence was under his control, and he would have it. There'd be no evidence leak out that he didn't want out. Johnson was the most powerful person in the Senate, and so Bobby had no authority, even though he was Attorney General, so he had to become president in order to get that authority. He really didn't want to be president, but that's the reason he ran for office. Now, Bobby was probably going to heavily investigate the CIA, and both Bobby and Jack were going to scatter the CIA to the winds and break it up. Now, this is sort of a humorous story about Carlos Marcello. Bobby had been trying to put Carlos in prison for a couple of years. They really argued it, almost hollered at one another in Senate hearings, and so Bobby wasn't able to get anything hard on him. So Carlos was born in Sicily, but his forged papers said that he was a citizen of Guatemala. So Bobby just said, well, I've got him out. They grabbed him, put him on an airplane, deported him to Guatemala. They got off the airplane, they loaded him in a truck, he and his attorney. They drove him about 30 miles off into the jungles, made him get out and left him there alone, and the truck left him. And you can imagine all the way back to civilization that Carlos Marcello didn't have any nice things to say about Bobby Kennedy. He was in his business suit and stomped through the mud and back into the jungles. Jimmy Hoffa also hated Bobby, and Bobby tried to put him in prison. And Hoffa had put out a contract on Bobby. It was never executed. But Hoffa said one time, you know, Bobby Kennedy every evening takes a swim in his swimming pool behind his house. And all you got to do is, there's a hill up behind that swimming pool. Me with my 270 rifle and a scope, I could pick him off easily because he swims by himself. And he made that statement to some people that passed it on. So a lot of people didn't like either one of the Kennedys. And I told you that Bobby didn't have any security. The Secret Service, even though he's running for office, wasn't assigned a Secret Service person. So I think he thought he was invincible, that he didn't really give it second thought that they would try to kill him just like they killed his brother, but they did. Now, before we get into Martin Luther King, let's talk about J. Edgar Hoover. He was Johnson's neighbor for a number of years. And again, as I got to wonder why J. Edgar Hoover hated Martin Luther King so bad. And then I received this document through the mail, and the title of it was Black Like Me. And this researcher had found out that J. Edgar Hoover's great-grandmother was a black lady named Hoover from Tennessee. And he resented his black blood, and he took it out on the black leaders of that time. And so that's the reason that Hoover was after Martin Luther King. Now, there was the Frank Church hearings in 1976 in the Senate revealed all these things that the FBI was doing to try to intimidate King and to brand him a communist. They would hire a good-looking black lady to be hired into King's office, hoping he would hit on her. They put out disinformation on Reverend King. They said that both white women and black women stand in line to sleep with Reverend King. And this is all related in the Senate hearings, the minutes of it. They tried to brand him a communist. And they, in this Senate hearing, the FBI admitted to the committee that they were never able to prove one thing that Martin Luther King did wrong. I heard the rumors of the women sleeping with King, and I believed it. But they say in these Senate hearings that the FBI was never able to prove that. In fact, they put out the lies to the press about that. And by the way, I sent a copy of this book to Caroline Kennedy and to Bobby Kennedy Jr. and to Dexter King and Coretta Scott King, because I wanted them to have closure to find out what really happened to their loved one. I didn't expect to hear anything from Caroline or Bobby, and I really didn't expect to hear anything from Coretta, but a couple of weeks ago I got a letter from her assistant. She ordered a case of these books to give out to her friends. And that made cold chills go all over me, that I had really satisfied her need. She knew that her husband was a faithful person, and I had produced the evidence that proved that. And I wrote her a letter and I said, I will be glad to come to Atlanta and speak to you and your staff and your friends on this subject, and at no cost. And so I'll probably get a call one of these days. She did pass word on. I saw an article in a paper that a member of the House of Representatives had canceled her hearing on COINTELPRO. And that was an operation by the FBI that was designed to blackball and to discredit King. And so when I saw that article and her name, I immediately sent her a copy of my book. And I was speaking to 3 groups out in California, and on the way back, this congresswoman had her assistant call my assistant and want to know where Mr. Ross is. And she said, well, he's in California. And so he said, she's going to California. Can she meet him there somewhere. And she said, I'm sorry, he's on an airplane coming back to Texas. And so he hung up, and about 30 minutes later, this congresswoman called my assistant personally and said, I need to get a hold of Mr. Ross. I want to find out more about what's going on. And she gave my assistant her private cell phone number, and so when I called her, she answered the phone. An assistant does not answer the phone. And there's a good chance I'll be meeting her in Baltimore when I speak there. And so I'm going to, after I finish this tour, I'll go to Washington to give the same talk to all of her staff and anybody that she can get up a crowd. And so that's a black lady from Georgia, and I'm so proud of her, and she's my friend, and I'm going to do everything I can to help her. Now let's talk about the death of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was shot at 6:01 p.m. April the 4th, 1968. He came to Memphis to help out the black garbage workers. They were trying to get some benefits or wages or something, and he was there to speak out for them. And so his assistants said that Reverend King was going to check into the, so they said, why stay at a inn owned by white people? Why don't you stay at a hotel or motel owned by a black person? So he said, that's fine. And so they booked him in the Lorraine Motel owned by a black person. And he was initially given a room on the first floor. For some strange reason, he was moved to the second floor. And at 6 o'clock that evening, he was standing out on the balcony, had his hand on the rail, talking to someone on the first floor, and a shot rang out from across the street, hit him in the jaw, broke a couple of vertebrae in his neck, ended up just under the skin on his back, and he died from that one shot. Now, the official investigation says that James Earl Ray was the shooter of Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray was a habitual criminal. His father was a habitual criminal. His brother was a habitual criminal. There's a FBI agent, a code name Raoul, had contacted James Earl Ray and told him meet him in Memphis there behind Jim's Grill. And so he did, and Raoul told James to go to the local gun shop and get a rifle with a scope on it. James got in his Mustang and drove to this gun shop, brought a rifle back, handed it to Raoul, and Raoul said, you idiot, this is a .243 caliber. Take it back and trade it for a .30-06. Now the distance from the shooter to King was something like 30 or 40 yards. A .243 is just as deadly as a .30-06. Why would he exchange the gun? Because the real shooter had a .30-06. And the law said that James was standing on the rim of a bathtub on the second floor of the flop house above Jim's Grill, shooting out of the window of this bathroom. And again, I was going through the photographs of the Associated Press and just flipping through them, and all of a sudden a photograph appeared, and it was a photograph taken from that window looking at the balcony where King was standing at the time of the shooting. And there was the leaves were off the trees, but there was a tree in the way, and so you could not get a clean shot at King from that window. Now the next day after King was killed, the Memphis Public Works Department came in and cut down all the bushes and trees on that ledge across from the Lorraine Hotel, looking for evidence. Right. They didn't want anybody to see that there was not a clean shot from that window. Now, when the shot was fired, there was a black lady named Betty Scaife that was a waitress in Jim's Grill. She heard the shot and went immediately into the kitchen. She thought something blew up. And as she entered the kitchen, the back door opened, and a fellow named Lloyd Jowers, the owner of Jim's Grill, entered the kitchen with a rifle with a scope on it in his hand. He slammed the door and said, "Woman, get up front and work on the customers." Betty went back up front. Lloyd ejected the spent cartridge, bent it on the counter, and threw it in the commode, flushed the commode, and it stopped up. Well, he had to fish it out, and he cleaned it up and put it in his pocket and later threw it in the river, the Mississippi River. But the rifle, he tore it, broke it down, wrapped it in a tablecloth and put it on the counter, and later he hid it. Well, how do I know this? Okay, there's a dear friend of mine is a private investigator in Memphis, and I spent 3 nights and days in his home, and we were going over all of this, and he said, "You know, there's one person that no one that I know of has ever talked to, and he really knows what went on in that case. I suggest you try to find him. I think he went to jail or something in Texas." Well, sort of sneaky guy, I found him in prison, and I interviewed him 3 times. I couldn't get him to go on video, but my friend told me that this fella came to Memphis 2 days after King was killed, and his first job in Memphis was a cab driver for Lloyd Jowers, and they became friends. And in fact, this fellow ended up as vice president of Lloyd Jowers' company. And one of the services that Lloyd Jowers' company provided was they were contract killers in the Memphis area. They'd killed about a dozen people in the Memphis area, Lloyd Jowers and this fellow. And so he said one night Lloyd Jowers and this fellow were out drinking, got skunk drunk, and Lloyd Jowers started bragging to him about being the actual shooter of King and told him where the rifle was. And this fellow, when I talked to him in prison, he says, if you can get me out of prison, he was only interested in getting himself out. He was in for 30 years on a cocaine charge. He had been caught with a kilo of cocaine and a mandatory sentence of 30 years in Texas. But he wanted me to try to get him out, and he kept holding out. But he said, "Now, if you can get me out, I'll tell you exactly where the rifle is, and I'll tell you everything about it." Of course, he told me, but he said, "I'll do it on camera." And I'm not sure the guy's still alive. I wrote him a letter about a month ago and told him I was trying to get the governor to give him a pardon if he would testify about that case. And I never did hear from him. So I need to call the guy that's in charge of public relations and see if he's still alive, because I have contacted Governor of Texas and tried to get him to issue immunity to witnesses or to issue a pardon for anyone that's been committed a crime if they will produce evidence, and hadn't been able to get him to do that yet. But I'm not the kind that gives up. Now, when James Earl Ray heard the shot there at the Lorraine Hotel, he was an escaped convict at the time. So when there's danger around an escaped convict, first thing you do is get out of there. So he hopped in his Mustang and slowly drove away. Well, there was a fellow that was a law enforcement officer, was hired to be there across the street from Lorraine Hotel up on top of a building. His job was to shoot James Earl Ray after the shot was fired. Just like Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald, he was supposed to kill James Earl Ray. And in all 3 deaths, there was a patsy in all those cases. Very similar crime. The reason it is the same people planned all of it. One person wrote the checks to all the killers and all the events, and in my book I give you the check number and the amount of checks that were paid to the killer of Martin Luther King. Lloyd Jowers got $10,000 Carlos Marcello got most of it. There was $1 million contract, and Carlos kept most of it and gave the shooter $10,000. But these are things that happen. Now, this fellow name is Jim Green that was supposed to kill James Earl Ray. He was positioned. He thought James was going to come out of this door over here, and all of a sudden he came out of the door over here. By the time he repositioned his rifle and was ready to shoot, James got away. And James drove to Atlanta. Jim Green followed him to Atlanta, got on the next airplane. They both went to Canada. And Jim missed him by an hour in Canada. He got away and flew to London. From London, he went to Portugal, stayed a couple of weeks, went back to London. Now, I was the last person to interview James Earl Ray before he died in Nashville, Tennessee Prison Hospital, cancer of the liver. And James told me that he was a patsy, and I said, well, but you confessed. And he said, well, the reason I confessed is my attorney told me that if I didn't confess, that I would go to the electric chair. If I confessed, I'd just go to prison for the rest of my life. And besides that, my father was an escaped prisoner from a penitentiary in Oregon, and they said they knew where he was. They weren't really interested in picking him up. He was just another criminal. But if he didn't confess, they were going to pick him up, put him in prison, and keep him in solitary confinement the rest of his life. And that his brother Jerry would be accused of being Raoul, and that Jerry would go to prison for the rest of his life. And so James did confess to the murder, and I think it's a week or two later he started his efforts to try to get a retrial because he confessed under duress, but he was never allowed a retrial. The killer of King, Lloyd Jowers, died of cancer of the throat about a year ago. I was trying desperately to get an interview with him, but the only way I thought that I could get an interview was to do a videotape of this fellow that's in prison in Texas and who was going to dump on him, and then go to Jowers' attorney and see if I could get him to give me an interview, that he was near death and that he really needed to confess before he died, but I didn't make it. But I'm convinced that James Earl Ray could very likely have been a Manchurian candidate because he had a lot of the traits of a person that is under control, and that the real killer was Lloyd Jowers, who owned Jim's Grill at 418 Main Street in Memphis. They killed King because he was speaking out against the Vietnam War all through the South. In fact, was planning to fly to Vietnam and ask the black soldiers to lay down their weapons and not fire again. King tried to discredit him, brand him communist, all sorts of things, and King was lobbying for civil rights for the blacks and was successful. And Lyndon Johnson thought that if blacks had civil rights in the South, that they would probably vote against him in the next election. And so those are the reasons why Martin Luther King was killed. The same people planned it. The same person wrote the checks for Bobby and Jack Kennedy. I have copies of those checks for the King killing at home. And well, I say at home, they're somewhere. Only my attorney knows where they are. But you have the same conspirators. I have Carla DeLoach. He was J. Edgar Hoover's main assistant. John J. McCloy, H.L. Hunt. And being a private citizen, King had no security. By the way, Frank Holloman, I have him listed as a co-conspirator because he was a ex-FBI agent for, I think, 26 years. He was in charge of Memphis police, and the Memphis Fire Department, which was located directly across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. So he was complicit in that killing himself. And now the CIA had developed chemicals or drugs that you could give to a person that were odorless, colorless, and it would kill them instantly. Why did not they use these chemicals on these three men? The reason they didn't is they shot them in a shooting gallery before the eyes of the world, and they did it because they could. Now tonight, I've told you who the elite are and were, and I told you about 4 tragic events that the elite were responsible for. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I'm trying to correct history. History is there for us to learn from. And if you can't learn from history, then why do we have history books? And we can't prevent something if the history's wrong. And if now that we know about the killers of these 4 men, if there were revised history, then maybe we could get something changed. And I thank you for coming, and I appreciate your careful attention tonight, and tell everybody that you can see about this story. Thank you very much.